of Barbados' economic recovery and transformation. So in that regard, I don't even feel like I have time for much preamble. I know you are a generous man, sir. You have proven yourself to be so in the past. I
wonder where all the platitudes came from.
One of my favorite plays that I studied at school was called A Streetcar Named Desire, and in it, one of the characters, Blanche, says, "I have always depended on the kindness of strangers." So, sir, you are not a stranger. So I may lean a little bit more on your kindness. But I begin at this place, sir, with respect to the notion of there being much to discuss in this Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Plan 2022, because when one reads the document, one begins to understand how many balls the government always has in the air at any given time on the matter of economic management and social well-being. The BERT Plan, the second version, as did the first, covers almost every area of socioeconomic prosperity and transformation in the country. And I begin there, sir, because I think sometimes collectively we do not appreciate all of the different activities that have to exist, that have to go on at once in order to make sure that people thrive, in order to make sure that people benefit. The international environment, as the young people like to say, is not normal. It's not normal. And we got in the habit of often saying that we live in unprecedented times. And it started to sound like a bit of a platitude, as you say, sir. It started to sound like something that we just say. But I do not recall, certainly in my lifetime, and I've lived a little bit now, I certainly do not recall in my lifetime having this mix of challenges that face us. And to be frank, even some of the things that we represent as specific small island challenges are now affecting the rest of the world. When this delegation from Barbados goes to Egypt next month, when the Alliance of Small Island States delegation goes to Egypt next month, and continue to push the argument for extreme and severe loss and damage, continue to push the argument that we are on the front lines of the climate crisis, the conversation will not be as easy as even as it was in Glasgow last year when I had the privilege to lead the delegation. Because between the wildfires in China and in certain states in the US, the floods, yes, in Pakistan, but also in some of the major emitting countries, the fact is that the narrative that we are now hearing is, well, we are now all frontline states. Why are you all special? We are also experiencing loss and damage. So the conversation keeps changing on us. The international environment is not normal. I need not repeat all of the things that were said before about pandemics and floods and wars and rumors of wars and pestilence. I need not repeat that because I'm sure that many of us never thought that we would experience some of these issues all at once and be around to witness them. And so Barbados is an island, yes, but it does not exist in a vacuum. And I start there to suggest, sir, that sometimes I think that the conversations that we have seem to suppose that we are not to experience or to bear witness to any of the challenges the world is facing. As if we are somehow completely, or meant to be completely ring-fenced, completely protected. And yes, it is the role of a government to be able to respond when things that we have not predicted happen. And that's a big part of our argument, to have predictable liquidity in the event of a disaster. That's why many of the policies that you'll see in this BERT plan speak to that. But I do not see how it is possible to never bear witness, and I say bear witness because that speaks to the experience, that speaks to having to partake in, to participate in the world's recovery, the moral recovery of the world from where we are. We don't get to sit it out. And others in this honorable place will stand, will get to their feet, sir, and will speak about what this government has done to respond to the pandemic and the other crises. In many ways, those responses themselves have been unprecedented. When I look at the kinds of policies, for example, that acknowledge the role of the care economy, acknowledge the role of care in responding to the pandemic, a lot of what we all, especially as women, know about the role of unpaid care work, we saw play out in the pandemic. And the government of Barbados understood the household dynamics enough to be able to invest in a companion care program that many people don't talk about. We talk about how many NIS claims we paid, and again, that was something that the government very quickly mobilized to be able to do. We talk about the level of NIS claims that we paid. We talk about the business interruption benefits that were paid to small business owners. We talk about the response in the health sector. One of the things we talk less about is the extent to which we realize, listen, one of the more important economic inputs is care of children, care of the ill, care of the elderly in households. And many times those people who provide that care are invisible. They are there, they are struggling. Children who, people who care for children living with autism and other kinds of disabilities. Many balls in the air, sir. Many things to consider. And when one looks across the landscape, when one looks across the Western Hemisphere at how other economies and how other governments have responded, we realize that the government of Barbados did its utmost to shield the people of Barbados from the worst ravages of the last 3 years that we've just been through. But I always say that I don't know where we got the impression that in our generation of being alive on this planet, we would have no battles to fight. This is our battle to fight. And it's not up to government alone to fight it. You know, I always say to the honorable member who led this resolution, the honorable Prime Minister, that the same 280,000 people who stand to benefit from the transformation of this country are the same 280,000 people who have to execute it. We are a small island. And I say this because I want us to understand the resources that we have. There are many other countries that can dedicate all kinds of people resources to all kinds of things at the same time. We have to choose. And I'm being very honest about that. When I say that in the course of establishing the new Charter of Barbados, we have to choose what are the roles of all of the different actors. I am being very clear in that regard. What do the people of Barbados, what do the people of the region want our governments to be to us? What is the set of goods and services? What are the various responsibilities that we consider that the state should carry? And it is a very important conversation to have because it allows us to be able to hold the government accountable in the context of the things that we all agree the state should provide, because it cannot be everything. There can be no audience in this transformation. And sometimes I feel as if we expect that we are the audience and we are sitting back and we are watching a government or a private sector or a third sector or an international community or a CARICOM perform for us. Sir, there can be no audience in this transformation. The same 280,000 people who have to live here and benefit from whatever transformation happens are the same 280,000 people that have to execute the transformation, because you either work in the public service or you work in the private sector. You're either a student in a school, you're either a student in a university for which this government restored free tertiary education. You are not a bystander. You have to be a part of the transformation. So hold the government accountable. Hold the government accountable, but understand that you participate. And in my brief presentation, sir, I want to say a little bit about what that participation looks like. There are things that we need from the international community. That's one. There are things that we need from the Caribbean community writ large, including our sisters and brothers in Cuba and the Dominican Republic and other places in the wider Caribbean region. There are things, third, that we need from the government. There are things, number four, that we need from the private sector, including and especially small business. I say all the time, governments do not grow. I have this conversation with my beloved constituents all the time. Begin to set your sights, with our support, on small business, on the private sector, on finding a need and filling a need, because governments do not grow. And this growth that the Honorable Member for Christchurch West, who I know will listen with attention to our discussion on growth, but governments do not grow. So when we talk about this growth that has to bring us out of this recession, that has to be private sector led, it has to be inclusive, it has to be job led. So the international community one, the Caribbean community two, the government, the private sector, and the individual all have to be a part of the transformation. So yes, comment. Yes, engage with us. Yes, engage with your government, but also understand that any indictments on our performance as a country are indictments on all of us. Now, sir, I am not interested in any growth that is not driven by the masses of people in this country and in this region. And one would, sometimes it feels like a real sense of deja vu. It feels like there was a film called Groundhog Day, where you felt like you were just repeating yourself. In this business of development economics, every now and then, a new economist comes up saying the things that we all said 25 years ago, and that person is a new celebrity. But we've proven, sir, that trickle-down economics does not work. This notion that as long as you're getting growth, as long as you're measuring an expansion in GDP, that you've done your job. We know that trickle-down economics doesn't work. And so I am not interested, sir, in any growth that is not driven, that is not led by the people of this country. The honorable member who spoke before me, the member for Christchurch West, mentioned the tribute that we paid to Robert Luther Miller Clark. He's called the name already, so I assume that I have that prerogative as well, sir. Bobby Clark, who was not my family, but certainly an icon in our context that represented freedom and represented social justice. And one of his daughters said something about him that just resonated with me so much. Earlier in this year, when there was a tribute to him while he was still with us, she said of her father, he continued to practice justice in courts as opposed to law. He continued to practice justice as opposed to law. Similarly, sir, I'm interested in the practice of economic justice and economic empowerment as opposed to economics. That is what we have to concern ourselves with. Government has to be the great equalizer in these matters, because if we leave it up to this thing called the market with a capital M, people will be left behind. And so I want to say something quickly about growth, and as I go through for the next couple minutes, I will try to talk about those things that we can expect from the international community, these 5 actors in our growth plan, from the Caribbean community, from government, from the private sector, and from each of us. But before I do that, I want to say one final thing quickly. There are those who pretend to care about growth or pretend to understand or believe growth to be a question of government picking a couple winners and investing capital in those sectors and forcing them, no matter their viability, to perform. So those that you hear, I have some very good friends at the university, but I continue to challenge them to come down off the hill and step down among us and understand what is happening in this country. Get out of the textbook and join us in the real world. This notion that a country comes up with a growth strategy that's 178 pages long, and it says in each sector what must happen, that is not real. A government of our size, a country of our size, should in fact pick a couple winners, as the government has done with renewable energy, with the renewable energy sector, which gives us a space where people can earn and create real wealth, as well as an avenue by which we address the question of the emissions in our environment that are not good for any of us. Beyond that, the country has also chosen to look at the agriculture sector, because it is critical, not just to produce food, but also it's critical to help us integrate the Caribbean and with the rest of the world in terms of developing value-added products and services that can create an income for Barbadians and those who live here. And that includes its targeting of the medicinal cannabis industry, although, as I have argued in this honorable place before, one has to rationalize the economic production side with the judicial side. One has to bring justice to bear on saying to a population, you can use this plant here to earn money legally, but we don't let you use in this plant in other ways. There is a bit of a dissonance in the posture. And I'm sure that this government will seek to correct that dissonance in the posture soon, as we saw the leadership in the United States do very recently. So yes, one needs to pick a couple sectors that we believe can help people thrive. But that is not the growth model that makes sense for us now. The growth model that makes sense to us now is the one that is outlined in the BERT Plan, which is to create an environment in which I can have an idea. And my idea can create income and wealth for me, for my neighbors, for my children, for their children. As long as you create the environment for that to happen, any sector can grow. That is the model that is outlined in the BERT Plan. So yes, there's some sectoral emphasis. I do not think that any government should be taking scarce financial resources and dumping wholesale into a particular sector. The private sector must perform. That model did not work for us because when we put all of those scarce eggs in one basket, what happened? When there's a crash in that one sector. I see lots of conversations about the extent to which government should be investing in tourism. I even saw people suggest that the government was building hotels, which, from my understanding, the ones that on which ground was broken recently are being developed by the private sector. Now, there's a lot that can be said about the tourism sector. There's the question of the tourism multiplier. There's the idea, which we know to be true, that much of the foreign exchange that we are counting as generated from the tourism sector does not remain here. And it has to stand as a challenge not just to those who lead in the sector, but to all of us. Because we know that there's a certain amount of leakage when it comes to foreign exchange. And so similarly, when we set up an incentives framework, and incentives are referenced in the document, but I caution that any incentives framework in the tourism sector has to relate not just to permanent high-quality jobs, not just to the creation of permanent high-quality jobs, but also to the extent to which you are generating foreign exchange that remains in the country. Because when I build a hotel, where am I getting the inputs from? I'm taking up foreign exchange, and I'm importing, as the Open will say, I'm importing what to bill it with. Similarly, in the tourism product itself, lots of bookings are made overseas. So if you come to me and you say, I believe that under certain legislation, I should be entitled to certain concessions, show me the level of foreign exchange that is staying here and benefiting this country. Talk to me in those terms, because if you don't talk to me in those terms, I'm not giving you the concessions. Luckily, those listening to my voice don't have to worry because I'm not in the government. But were it up to me, that would be the framework. That was the framework that we put forward to be able to reframe the incentives. To be able to say, don't just come and ask for concessions, but show us how your investment is productive. And so the granting of concessions will then be based on the high-quality permanent jobs that you create, will then be based on the level of foreign exchange, the amount of foreign exchange that is staying here, as well as the extent to which your investment is green and does not contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. And I suspect that that is likely to be the framework that this government may revisit soon. But that is one of the very important transformations with respect to how we administer the sector. But the final thing I will say on this sector, sir, is that I cannot think of any country that will have a resource like the tourism product of this country, which does need to be renewed and renovated, and I have every confidence that the government is working on that renewal. and that diversification within the sector itself. Our visitor economy is not a sun, sea, and sand economy, let's be real. We have people who have invested in this country, who come here, who live here for 3 months, 4 months, 5 months at a time. And so that visitor economy is people coming for healthcare, is people coming to go to school, is people coming to enjoy the country. But don't let us fool ourselves that any country that has a competitive advantage in a sector is not going to continue to build on that competitive advantage. It would be a fool's mission for Barbados to shut up shop tomorrow in the tourism sector and say we are finished with that. It would be a fool's mission for almost, I would dare say, every member in this honorable place whose constituents work in the sector, not just directly, but in the agriculture sector, in the hospitality sector, in the beauty sector, and have that multiplier effect come through to their businesses. So, sir, quickly, I want to touch on a couple other things that are important for the execution of the growth strategy. Because much of what is in BERT 2022 reinforces what we know we need to do for transformation. But I want to just mention a couple of things that I expect that when the actual implementation plan comes, that we will see a little bit more of. So there are things we need from the international community. There are things on which we need to act at the global level and on which we need global solidarity and action. Integration with global online platforms is one of them. Sir, this market in Barbados is extremely small. I know of people who have started small businesses in the last 2 years that have already reached as much of the market share as they're going to get. They're not going to grow anymore in Barbados because they've found their consumer, they've found all of them, and that is it. In this 2022, you are not selling unless you are selling online. In this 2022, if you have creative content, you are not in anything unless you are able to make it available online, on Alibaba, on Amazon, on YouTube, etc. And the kind of global technology frameworks that will allow Barbadian young people to monetize their content on these platforms, to be able to sell freely in online marketplaces, that is the next frontier of economic transformation. You know, sir, 15 years ago, I was in Santiago in Chile with a team from the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, talking about this question of vulnerability. Because we talk about debt vulnerability, we talk about climate vulnerability. But one of the things we put on the table at the time on this question of vulnerability was being able to measure a country's capacity to develop and adapt to new technologies as one of the ways to measure whether a country was really vulnerable. Are we adapting to new technologies? I saw there was a young man, somebody sent me a video of a young man saying that he was going to start some work. He was doing some advocacy to see how Barbadian young people could get to monetize their YouTube content and other kinds of content. Because we realize that if you're not in those environments, then you're not in anything. So what in our formal and non-formal education and enabling environment is preparing us to be high-knowledge economies that produce and not just consume high-value tech products? Where are we in our cybersecurity agenda? And do we stand to be left behind in one area of economic activity that has the capacity, if we dare to allow it, that has the capacity to equalize the world? If we miss this digital revolution, if we are not able to get access to those marketplaces, we miss the opportunity for job-led growth that we're not going to catch up with. So that at the international level, we need that. But we need to have action at our level to be able to make that happen. Regional transport at the CARICOM and the Caribbean community level is another. I mean, it is scary to believe that we cannot move, not just to take advantage of business opportunities, but if we really had to have any sudden need for people to move today, all at once, how would we get them to move? We are in a regional transport conundrum that we need to solve, because those people who are developing businesses here that have reached the capacity of their market share, they need to leave. So having a situation where you can't travel directly from here to Jamaica, or the cost of air travel is prohibitive from here to St. Lucia, is also something that we have to solve. And I say these things to suggest to you that the transformation that Barbados needs calls for action, not just here, but calls for action at several levels. So we need to move affordable and healthy food between our islands. We need to move people, and we need to have something that I believe we've targeted in the form of a unified telecommunication system and a single roaming rate, so people can do business with each other. We need, at the national level, and obviously the things I will say are not exhaustive, but there are things, sir, that have rested on my bosom in considering this BERT plan. So I know how to get the attention of the member for St. James Central. One of those things is a better valuation and registration and use of our assets. You know, we talk about this, what was it, $14 billion in domestic savings that we have here. I believe at the end of March this year, the central bank put the figure at 14 billion, which suggests that household savings have grown. But while we do want people to take advantage of the higher interest rates from BOSS bonds, BOSS plus bonds, writ large, we need to have a framework within which people can really invest. What are the instruments? Where is the money going? That's what we need. We need to have integration into the regional stock exchanges that are performing. And I don't say that, that's not to say that the Barbados Stock Exchange cannot be led to perform, but Trinidad and Jamaica and others have realized the wisdom of combining our efforts in that regard. The money needs somewhere to go. We talked about a sovereign wealth fund. I anticipate that in the growth strategy document that accompanies this BERT plan, that we will also see that come to fruition. Sir, we talked about the financial management legislation. And the Honourable Member, the Honourable Prime Minister talked about the procurement legislation that will help flesh out that very comprehensive set of work that has been done. That is so critical. It is not just critical to allow Barbadians to understand how to get access to certain works that are led by government and others, but it is similarly critical to be able to build trust and transparency. This government said that contracts over $1 million would be laid in Parliament in the context of COVID, because we wanted people to understand that just because you have to move fast doesn't mean that you're not accountable. I do not know why we cannot make that the subject of an amendment to the existing legislation. I think we can, because we have to remember that we're not just governing for today. We're governing for a time when those who might seek to come to this honorable place may not be as honest as the ones that occupy it today. Let's be real. And while we may all say, and quite rightly so, well, look at here, I don't have anything to hide, I want the legislation to compel me to show it. I don't mind being compelled to show because I have nothing to hide. And so I would love to see us have that register of contracts over $1 million published on Parliament's website. I believe that the Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central is making some efforts in that regard now. And this just stands as some words of support for those efforts that I believe that he's making. Public sector reform, sir, is mentioned in the BERT Plan. When I was studying economics at the Catholic University of Santo Domingo in 2000, I wrote about public sector reform in Barbados. It was going on then, 22 years ago. So ongoing was the process that there was a logo. I think the logo still exists. That attached to all government documents that has said public sector reform. What does that look like? How do we know that we are finished or that we've reached success? The commitment for results approach that will hold all of us and every single public officer accountable for the work that they show up to do every day is necessary. I don't just want to hear public sector reform. It got to the point where it was like the words had no power. Because it's not a challenge. It's not a challenge to say whether or not public officers are working, that we've gone past that. And I think sometimes we focus a little too much on people and not enough on systems. Systems. Do we have the kind of systems in place that mean that certain things don't fall through the cracks? Do we have the checks and balances that mean that somebody is going back to look and make sure that this thing happens when we said it would happen? And so we can't continue to pay lip service to that question anymore. It has to be real. But all of us that make up the social partnership and that make up the public service in this country have to commit to it being real. There can be no bystanders in this transformation, sir. Sir, I finally want to come to the last two sectors that I think that are mentioned in BERT 2.0 that we have to make sure we wrestle to the ground. One of them is transformation in the transport sector. The other is transformation in the housing sector. When it comes to the issue of transportation, we have certain targets set in the energy policy. Decarbonization of the transport sector is critical. But the truth is that we also need, in trying to meet those targets, we also have the opportunity to meet other targets, which is to make it easier for people to move. And to improve the public transport system in such a way that people feel confident and comfortable to not own a car, as we see in certain other jurisdictions. I said recently on this topic, sir, that the test of a developed country is not whether the poor own cars, but whether the rich take public transport. And that means that that public transport has to be of a quality that the member for St. Michael South, member for St. James North, you, sir, would be happy to sell your car, to leave your car home, and to take public transportation. That is a test, because we cannot build a sector for poor people. A government that is serious about development does not build out a sector with thinking that only poor people is to use this thing. We have to build it to the quality that we would use it happily. That is the next frontier of transformation in the transport sector. And similarly, in the housing sector, I have a question on my mind, sir. Do we know how people want to live? Do we know how people want to live? When people think about the circumstances in which they live, do they want a large yard? Do they want to be close to town? Do we know? Because I think that a lot of the time we have a vision that we've brought from wherever we've brought it. We have this notion of an unfinished agenda, and we come now to bring it to a sector without reference to how people want to live. A good colleague of mine just sent me a picture of his new house that is built from a repurposed container. It is a part of the new tiny homes craze that's sweeping the world. Placed in a shared services kind of environment where everything that he needs is there. I am not saying that if a person doesn't want a yard, that if a person wants a yard, they shouldn't have it. But I'm saying let's understand that in this Barbados, people may have no objection to going up with their housing instead of going across. Let's understand how people really want to live. Because perhaps we will solve problems. Perhaps we will be able to respond more easily to the housing needs if we liberalize in our minds this model of housing that we think people have. Now, if when we talk to people, we realize that everybody wants a housing lot of a certain size and a yard of a certain size and so on, that's fine. But I dare say that we won't find that.
Honourable member has 2 more minutes.
I dare say, thank you, sir, that we won't find that. But let us challenge our thinking in that regard. The final part of this BERT plan and of this narrative on growth and social transformation has to do with understanding whether people are thriving. And I look forward to the contribution of the member for St. Michael South, my good neighbor, best neighbor you could have. On the matter of being able to monitor, I think I've started a bit of a revolution here, sir, because I called out one of my neighbors, but all of my neighbors are wonderful colleagues. All of my neighbors are wonderful colleagues. But, sir, we have to understand how people are living. I see in the BERT plan a focus on data, an independent statistics authority, and so on. That's great. But we find that countries tend to be better at economic data and tracking GDP and so on than they are at understanding what's happening with people's welfare and people's well-being. We had a poverty study in 2016. And we tend to use all these proxies to really understand whether people are thriving, what is this level of their well-being. And remember, for St. Michael South, as a practitioner in this area, he and I talk about this all the time, that poverty moves. People move, they're vulnerable, they're poor, something happens, they get an opportunity, they have an opportunity to strengthen their income or their base of wealth. Conversely, something may happen, they have a hospital bill, they lose a job, they weren't poor before and they're poor now. Let us understand that we don't have a basket that the poor live in. We don't just count the poor and keep them there and they're poor forever and that number never changes. It is something that changes. And we have to have a way to be able to measure that So that just as how we have the early warning systems for tsunamis and the early warning systems for all kinds of things, we have early warning systems that tells us when people are at risk of becoming poor and indigent. We need to measure that properly. We need to measure debt sustainability. We need to know the debt to GDP ratio. We need to know all of that. I want to know objectively who is struggling, what are the multiple deprivations that people experience in education, in housing, objectively. And I have every confidence that the member for St. Michael South, the member for the city, and their teams will be able to take us there. Sir, I close with these final remarks. A government in a country of this size, with the targets, the aspirations, the will that this Barbados Labour Party government has to do right by its people, a government of that nature will always have several balls in the air. Just read this BERT plan. We are aiming to transform everything at once, and for that reason, sir, there is no audience here. There can be no bystanders here. We all need to pick up the part that corresponds to us, to pick up the people that correspond to us, and to bring everything, all of our skills, all of our people, our neighbors, our family along, to make sure that all prosper. And with those words, sir, I commend this resolution to this House.